Hello and welcome back to the Potential podcast. Today we have Lauren Barney on. Lauren, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chelsea. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Lauren is a former FSO at the State Department and she is a fellow China expert. So super excited that we can connect again. Just disclosure, Lauren and I went to school together at the Hopkins Stanching Center. So yeah, really excited to have you on. And it's super timely that you're coming on with the news about the U.S. Iran war today. So Lauren is here to share the latest and greatest, but more in terms of how that relates to China. So you have this piece that you've been working on about the ceasefire and what this really reveals about China's bet on the Middle East, right?
Yeah, so right now I'm working on a piece that should be published very soon on essentially the Washington intelligentsia view of Sino-Iranian or China-Iranian relations. In that framework, we kind of look at the Middle East as though it's a chess piece between the US and China. And there's a lot of talk about China as a greater chess piece or maybe the queen in this game with the US. Unfortunately, I think that's the wrong approach and that we're heading in the wrong direction when we think that way. And China's really just on the periphery in this conflict, as we've seen so far.
I really like how you wrote the paper. You brought up a lot of interesting points. I'm wondering if we could delve a little bit deeper into some of the misperceptions that the U.S. has about China and its role in the Middle East. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I think the first misperception and the biggest one that we have is that, and I would say that first it starts at the competition level between us and China. Then if you move to the regional level, there's a whole nother dynamic playing. And then finally, in terms of U.S.-Iran relationship and U.S.-China relationship, those kind of rivalry at that level is completely a separate kind of view from the other two. So if we take it at each level, I would say that the perception right now in Washington is that China is our big rival in the region and they are benefiting the most, that they are able, us being caught up in Iran is pulling us away from Taiwan, is boosting their appeal internationally, especially as this narrative that China plays, that it's, the opposite to U.S. hegemony and that they are creating a shared destiny in the future. And I think if we actually look at what's happening, that can all be true. At the same time, that's not really the outcome that I'm interested in, right? The outcome that I'm interested in from this conflict is that China is actually able to position itself with little damage to its image. And I think that in what I saw from my diplomacy with China and my diplomacy with the Middle Eastern countries when talking to the Middle East counterparts about China was that there really is no expectations for China. China is expected to just bring economic prosperity to the region and not meddle too much in the region. And that's what China sells itself as globally, right? And the US, we are viewed as having strings attached to our diplomacy and our help and aid. And we're considered in the region to bring security to our partners. But then a war like this kind of shows regionally to the Middle East countries that maybe their security is a little threatened. And that's what China's narrative is, what they're playing. And I think when we look at what China's doing is we think that they are just like us, that they're mirroring us, that they want a very strategic move within the region, that their relationship with Iran is very strategic, and that they're, either focused on energy or helping them avoid sanctions or moving away from the US. But in reality, the actual on the ground events, especially with other states, is that China is really just nowhere to be found and that they're just on the sidelines. And when they are there, they're there in ways that I think the US could benefit from exposing. And so the first way that I think China is really in the region is that they're buying Iran's energy and giving it that lifeline. And the energy relationship means a lot more to Iran than it does to China. I think the last statistic is like the overall energy share that Iran is giving China is about 2% of its total or 4% of its total energy consumption so the Iranian imports are 2 to 4% of its total consumption. Whereas for Iran, it's, I think, somewhere in the 90% of what it sells to China in terms of energy. So China is really there in general with the relationship with Iran. But again, what kind of Washington is getting wrong about this is that it's not all about the energy. It's not all about the economics. It's not even all about the dual use components that China is allegedly selling to Iran, or even the straight military material that China is selling to Iran. It's about what is China selling itself as, and how can the U.S. expose what China is actually doing and maintain that security relationship that we have with really strong partners like Israel and the Gulf.
Yeah, so I'm curious what your, first of all, very well put. In terms of what China is actually doing, you and I both lived in China for a while, and we're understanding of the difference between maybe state rhetoric versus action. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your experience with that, either through diplomacy or personal experience, because I think sometimes listeners who don't interact with China will see what China is saying. I know that they have a really effective, say, campaign on social media. So wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, some big plays that are happening in terms of especially social media and the shifts we've seen in China in general is this move towards pro-Arab, anti-Semitic rhetoric online. And that is something that I think we can decide in general that China could control and decides to run rampant. So that's something that we at the State Department, when I was there, was actually working with the special envoy for anti-Semitism, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, to talk about these issues with China, to raise them, and hope that from the state level that they would try to mitigate these terrible influences that really affect international relations. That aside, I think that something even bigger is that China tends to, in the public eye, say we want all sides, a non-interference type of policy in bilateral relations between two countries. So the way China views this conflict with Iran is that this is between the US, Israel, and Iran, or maybe even just US, Iran, and A, B, see you later. China wants to see itself out, and it says that it is not involved at all. As we know, it is involved. And so I think that what China is actually trying to do is, I would have to look for the exact figures. I don't believe that China really has that much interest in Iran besides the energy, right? In terms of population there, compared to a lot of other countries in the Middle East and across the world, I'm not sure that they have a huge expat community that they're trying to protect. They're definitely trying to ensure that because of the geopolitical closeness, we've seen a lot of rhetoric and talk from China on protecting its western borders and building different corridors of economic activity that can avoid these types of conflicts in the Middle East. So all of that is very true. I think that for the majority of what China's trying to do quietly, and what they wouldn't say outright, is that this relationship with Iran is one of convenience. It's not a natural relationship. Iran and China, historically, the two empires had not gotten the best along, right? And I think for me, I've looked at this, I'm not a huge Sino-Russian expert, but I do believe that when you look at that type of relationship, of kind of the frenemies relationship, if you will, I think that's where Iran and China see themselves. And so now in the modern times, when there's what they would view as a US imperialist doctrine, that they need to combat this for the world they see themselves as the leader of the global South, even though we know that China is much more advanced now than a lot of global South countries. And so I think that the Middle East, for them in particular, for China, is a very hard part of the global South. China has won the hearts over most of Africa. It has won the hearts over most of, I would say, to some degree, because of geography, it's won the hearts over most of Southeast Asia. And its probably biggest challenges in terms of U.S. China relations or U.S. China rivalry would be with both East Asia and the Middle East. And so I think that with the Middle East, we have the opportunity. They really think that Iran is the opportunity for them, for China, to be the thorn in the side of the US. And so if they can continue to exploit like an underdog mentality with Iran, that will help. I think one big part of US diplomacy that you'll see across administrations is the request over and over again for China to pressure its strategic partner in Iran. And we all know that, and that request is interesting, right? Because it is in China's interest to get Iran to come to negotiating tables, to create more stability in the US, to not stoke chaos in the region. But at the same time, it is somewhat in China's interest. And when they're speaking directly to Iran, most likely they're saying that, look, this is an opportunity for us. We're the innocent ones. We're the victims here. This is long-arm jurisdiction and hegemony of the US. Let's combat this together. But also, let's end this when it's convenient for us. And so there isn't necessarily this big, grand strategic plan that I think is portrayed in Washington towards what they think China is doing with Iran and what Iran's doing with China. And there's also not this complete non-interference by China in the region. So I think that I would leave it there, but I'm happy to answer more if you want to pull out anything that I say.
Oh no, there's so many questions I want to ask. Oh gosh, there's so many things I want to say. I think I'm just going to say two questions I'm interested in out loud that popped into mind, but we can address them separately. So first, I'm curious when you were at the Department of State, what was interacting with these different governments like? Obviously, we have a very different administration right now, but I know that every government has its own personality. And I was just thinking if we could walk through for listeners what that looks like, what you're able to disclose or share realistically about what that experience is like is a fun kind of insight into the behind the scenes, because I think a lot of people don't understand the nuance that goes into planning these things. They see a big event and they go, oh, nothing was signed, this and that. But in actuality, there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes. And then the other thing that I thought would be fun to dig into a little bit before getting back to the exact topic itself is you've been in the DC circuit for a hot minute. You are a true expert in this space. And I'm wondering if we could have an understanding bit of maybe if there's even different factions or approaches to these types of issues in terms of China. For instance, even in the White House itself right now, we have different approaches on a variety of issues, whether that be China, emerging technology, energy. And so I think those are two things I would like to dig into. Is there either one you want to start with?
I can start with, I think the first one will be kind of quicker.
Yeah.
So I can start with that one.
Okay, yeah,
There's not
let's
much
do
I
it,
can
yeah.
disclose. I'd
Yeah,
say,
okay.
like, if you spoke with any diplomat, there's kind of two parts to every relationship, right?
Mhm.
There's the negotiations directly, bilaterally with a country, and then you're constantly talking to all your friends in general, right? About all different topics. So you have the relationship, if kind of want to make it's World Cup time. So if you want to make it about that, there's the relationship on the ball, right? There's the attacker, striker, or whoever has possession of the ball going and trying to challenge the other defender, right? But then there's also the people constantly moving off the ball. And so when you're doing diplomacy, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, you're constantly engaging with so many actors at once. It's really like a political scientist's dream, I think. So with China in particular, discussing the Middle East, a lot of it, like I said, is making requests of China. And I can't go into the detail, obviously, of what exactly we requested while I was there. But in general, like in working in U.S. interests, you're always making asks of other countries, especially when there's times of conflict. I would assume right now I don't have direct insight or direct view of what's going on behind the scenes, but I assume that at some point a request, and that was alluded to in the readouts from Trump's visit to China recently to Beijing. But, Trump is obviously engaged on Iran, made requests. I would say that from what I saw, I think that sometimes even it was important to make those requests because a big part of diplomacy is ensuring that you make it known to the other actor, the other partner, ally, rival, whoever it is, that this is important to you. So if you don't raise something and it's not making, if you only have time to discuss 5 subjects, if it's not making the top 5, then that's a signal to the other actor, the other country, the person you're interacting with, whoever it is, that's not highest priority in your relationship with them, which makes sense. So I think that the fact that it was brought up, the Iran conflict in the Middle East, that's brought up frequently with Chinese counterparts, and you'll see it throughout readouts. I think that's obviously a really big indication that this is something that we think that the Chinese can work on and pressure Iran. I think what was interesting, though, was what I saw was that then there'd be a readout from China, and it's not, they're more, we all know, and I think something that China sinologists look at all the time is that China is obviously more concerned about its economy, keeping the regime alive, the CCP alive. They're worried about Taiwan. For them, Iran is number 10 on the list most of the time, right? And like I said, it's important to them in terms of getting some of their energy. But as they continue to move towards renewables and that's going to be less and less reliant on Iran in the far future. So definitely near term, it's an important relationship for them to some degree for their domestic economy. But they're worried about their domestic politics more than anything, and they consider Taiwan as part of those domestic politics, right? And so when they're international relations, they're going to be focused on that. Whereas the U.S. is focused way more on our outstretched arm abroad and keeping we see our national domestic security as part of our international security, which is a very different view of the world. And it's also based on I believe the big difference between China and the US is the last time China fought a war was a very long time ago. And the US is fighting wars. And so we need to continue to reach out to our partners and ask them to pressure Iran, right? And through back channels, continue to work on these issues. But that's going to be very different. That kind of brings me to the next side of things, which is when we're doing diplomacy with China, you also have to talk to your Gulf partners. You have to talk to Israel. You have to talk to other actors in the region about how they're interacting with China and what they can ask China in this conflict as well. And so I would suppose if I was still in my job at the department, that I would have advocated for when we're interacting with our Gulf partners, and asking them when they talk to Beijing to also ask them to interact with Iran, right? And so I think that when I was in the department, there was the Iran-Saudi deal that Beijing mediated. And so I think that what we saw from that was, although Beijing, we're not really sure what they even got from either, and I would say that they didn't really do much. The fact that both Saudi and Iran were willing to use Beijing as a venue says a lot about where potential lies. And so it is important to continue to do that diplomacy from a U.S. perspective, I would believe, even in this Trump administration. And getting a high-level visit, a presidential visit out to Beijing is a really big deal. And that is something that Beijing shouldn't take lightly. And I think the fact that the president brought it up opposed to anyone else shows that at the highest levels of diplomacy, this is a really big deal for the US and China should take note. And that's something where I know for most of especially for me, I know I started out very open-eyed, thought we could work with China on everything when I was a student there. And I think a lot of people kind of have this revelation that as they grow in their careers and their experience is that you realize that it's very limited ideologically what we can do with China. And I think that this is one area where if China was willing to not undermine, which might not be in their best interest, I'm not sure that we could all work together to make peace in the Middle East, as that corny as that sounds. And then I would say the second question again was more about what different views are in Washington, you would say on.
Yeah, approaches to Washington. When I was there, I feel like China sphere tends to have an echo chamber of certain things we talk about, but in terms of actionable approaches, in terms of how we deal with it, that's a little bit different, I would say.
Yeah,
Curious on your read. Yeah.
yeah, I think there's a lot of different approaches. I think the biggest issue we have that I would assume even China's aware about is because they made a promise while during the Biden administration and then again trying during the Trump administration to bring more Americans to China to study and approving more visas and getting more interactions in. I think in the reality, and something that you and me know very well, there's just very few people actually going to China. And that is both by design by China. There are real threats to Americans' lives to go abroad. I saw it firsthand to a lot of places. And China is one of those countries that at times gets very high level warnings about detaining Americans. And so I think that there's a real threat there, but we need to get more Americans to see and experience China firsthand, not in an embassy compound or not in just a closed off university, but it needs to be something like what we experienced at Hopkins Nanjing, where you're really interacting with Chinese people and you're getting out there and understanding how China views the U.S. And just a little anecdote from our time there. I don't know if you remember, but it was during the primaries for the U.S. elections
Okay.
and
Yeah. Yeah, that's
presidential
okay. Yeah.
elections. Yeah. And I just
Yeah.
remember all the Chinese
Goosebumps.
students asking us what was happening and why is Trump winning, and very confused how our primary system works. And just being able to explain from American point of view how great it is that we have a democracy and we have these type of opportunities for even at the time, Trump was very much on the outsides of politics and very much a dark horse in the race. So the fact that he was able to beat out well-established candidates, something that would never happen in China, and trying to explain that in and of itself was really interesting. And to understand that perspective, the Chinese, of seeing what they would consider a strong leader and how they react to Trump being elected and what they think that says of U.S. people is unmatched in any other form of study or any other work trip that you could take. And so I think between that and really understanding the language and being able to read first primary sources is really important. And I think that's something that we as Washington can do a lot better at and get better at. And I know the State Department was investing in more Mandarin study for officers. Me, as even a civil servant, was offered more coursework to take and improve my Mandarin. So I know that there's programs out there and that it hopefully will continue, but that's definitely something that I hope over time we can gain better primary source understanding. And I think last but not least, I think that echo chamber that gets created, I think, from not going to China is the idea that, China is this almost boogie monster of a rival is rising, and we start believing our own propaganda mixed with the CCP propaganda of China as an actual rival to the US. But the truth is China's population is declining. They're going to have to figure out a lot of ways in which to address that domestic economic, macroeconomic, potentially catastrophic situation. And so with those, and in the US, we're starting to see similar issues of declining birth rates and things like that when in the Western world. So we both have these big domestic economic issues that we're going to need to face. And I think that how we use the international arena to respond to those things are going to be very important. And I don't see yet how China's doing that. And I see them trying to do a lot of domestic technological innovation and trying to sell that abroad, but I don't really know how they're going to fix the problem. Like we said earlier, the US is much more global markets and China is still learning. It's kind of nascent, right? It joined the WTO in 2001, I believe. Am I off? So it's very
Yeah,
nascent to those
1, 2.
markets. Yeah. It's very nascent to those markets, to the idea of globalizing, exporting. It was very isolationist before. So I think all these bigger economic concepts, I'm going on a tangent here, but the point is a
Yeah.
lot of those bigger questions are not being answered here in Washington. And I think that we're losing, I think we're losing the actual picture for something greater grandstanding. For instance, we talk a lot, we forget that China is trying to hold up its regime, trying to focus on its domestic economy. And we lose sight for that, for trying to explain some sort of centering the United States in the story, saying that it's all about rivaling the US and pushing the US down to bring China up. And I think it's just more China using the US as a convenient scapegoat for its own domestic problems. But we don't really talk about that in Washington. And unless you're hearing something different. So I think that's where we could be heading a little bit more.
Yeah, I think in general, there's just a propensity in Washington, and you see this in workplaces, you see this just in society in general, where we get a bit sensationalist. And then also, just given our cultural background, we tend to moralize a lot of things. So that's a little bit easier for us to slip into, I would say. I think the other thing is we talked about a lot of issues, but yeah, I think one thing about China right now is at a very natural place in its economy for what it's doing in terms of going into other markets. I think one of the things that they're facing, besides dealing with the domestic things at home, which the US also has in its own regards, is it's facing a lot of a trust issue. And you brought this in very early to the conversation, is getting support, economic support from China is seen very much as no strings attached, so forth, so on. And they may be winning hearts and minds in some areas. But I would say that from my perspective, a lot of those states are still volleying between the US and China in terms of trying to receive support, unless they're, say, in an Iran position where they are enemies of the state, so to speak. But I think one of the main issues I've been talking with, this is just something you and I know from our studies, you from your lived diplomatic experience, me working on kind of government contracts at Boeing is, and then also speaking with Chinese companies, is there still is very much a trust and credibility issue. Because even if these countries are accepting support, that still does open up vulnerability. I have a cousin at the Hungarian embassy, and they will definitely talk with the Chinese, but they're very clear-eyed in terms of the vulnerabilities that opens up, and it's just weighing the pros and cons. I think it also comes down to, like you said, we can be mirroring and putting our views of our politics on China, but it operates completely differently. I think it also comes down to the fact that the United States and China have very two different global visions for the world. So you talk about this in your paper, you have huge expertise in this. I think it would be a failure to recognize that. And I'm just thinking out loud. But drawing it back to Iran and partners in the region, I guess I'm just surprised that Saudi Iran chose Beijing as a venue. The Middle East is not my area of expertise, but I would assume I've always had more of the idea that the US had a stronger hold on the Middle East. So I'm wondering, in terms of what the future plan for China is in the Middle East as a strategic lever, could you talk a little more about that? Also,
Yeah.
everything blew up this morning with the news.
Yeah, I think both of those two areas, between what seems like now a failed ceasefire might be looming or is looming, already failing, as very at least fraught, and what China wants to do in the Middle East is very similar, right? It's that it's very predictable what you think might happen, but there's still a lot of hope that something will be different. So I think The way that when I've been to the different places in the Middle East, that's the way that I feel like the region operates is very direct, very transactional, very much in the moment. I mean, I don't want to generalize the whole society but in general, to say the least, is that I believe that the Middle East is a very much more free place in that way. And so I think that because that's the culture there, and like you're saying, different from our culture in that way, that we try to moralize everything, they're trying to transaction everything. And I think that's where Trump succeeds a lot of the time, is when things become more transactional. He's able to make breakthroughs in the Middle East. And I think the same is happening with China here, is that at first I would say, oh, it was such a surprise that Beijing brokered something in the Middle East. But then when you delve into the details of what exactly happened, there was no brokering that I saw, right? They just brought two countries together and they were a venue. So if that's the case, why Beijing is the venue? Probably convenience, timing. I think the only real caution to US diplomacy at that point is that there was somewhat of an Oman track, right? And so the fact that it left Oman for Beijing is concerning, that this was something that was regional, that was trying to use established lines and put the US as a mediator, can sometimes maybe not work as well as picking a completely different venue. But as just in general, probably in negotiating conflict management theory, a lot of the times, sometimes you just need either a spoiler, a completely unbiased mediator, you need a completely new venue. And I think that's what happened, right? Saudi and Iran were willing to give Beijing a chance to do something. And maybe Saudis also felt as though, Iran wasn't really coming to the table in Oman. And maybe if they did it in a more neutral, what they would consider neutral, or what they would consider an maybe even more biased to Oman or Iran venue, maybe that's why they decided to use them. But to me, it wasn't the biggest shock, because Beijing is, if you look from Beijing's perspective now and not maybe from the region's perspective, I think that you could see that Beijing really did want to create a marquee name for itself in terms of showing support to the region. And they're not about to sell a bunch of arms everywhere in the region like the region would want. They're not going to be that security shield. They're not going to place bases to the same extent. And to be frank, I don't think the US would allow for an environment for them to start basing everywhere in the Middle East. And China is just never going to be that huge strategic player, where they're going to fill the gaps where the US leaves them. And I think, in terms, if you want to use the Saudi Iran deal or agreement, whatever you want to call it, from that era, I think that Beijing was just filling the gap that might have somewhat been created by what might have seemed, I would think, from the Saudi Iran perspective, as not failed talks, but stalled talks in Oman, and no breakthroughs happening. And Beijing takes advantage. We see that everywhere in the quote global south. You'll see in Africa, if the US is not willing to build something or mine somewhere because of environmental factors or different laws that we have that prevent certain investments, China's willing to come in with seemingly no strings attached and fill that void. Sometimes also, I know that there's a concern, we'd have to see the metrics when they come out, but different projects that might have been pulled back from USAID in different regions once it's closing, or different State Department grants, or even energy grants from the Department of Energy that might have been closed. Like those, we'll have to see if I think it will be hard for China to take over a lot of those spaces, because it's a little bit different than doing a diplomatic event. And we both know that China's very good at the pomp and circumstance. So they're very hosting a big mediation session is the least they can do, versus actually having to make actual investment in the region. It's a little bit more difficult for them.
Yeah, I think it's just interesting because we have obviously China with great ambitions, and it is doing quite well in its, I would say, global PR campaign, though there are still issues. It's interesting, I think, right now, because even compared to when you and I were in China, I've noticed that it's just exceptionally bold. Do you agree with that in terms of its wording? We saw this at the summit.
Oh, like bold in the sense of,
Like rhetoric.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Its rhetoric is getting a lot more aggressive, I think, because it feels as though it's beyond being a middle power to probably rivaling in its own rhetoric. It talks about being able to rival the US in a lot of different places. I think that around the globe, I think that the bigger thing with its rhetoric is not so much that it's more emboldened, but that we'd be remiss to not speak about the different initiatives that China has. So, like Belt and Road Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, all these initiatives, Global Civilization Initiative, they're trying to sell these across the globe as an alternative mechanism to the US. And I think because they have, yeah, this emboldened view of themselves, they're able to really capitalize on that in terms of actual policy action. And I don't know, a lot of, I think, sinologists would prescribe this as like a big strategic undermining of the US. And I think it's more, I think China's a lot more self centered. And it's more as though what conditions can they create globally to make a system that's more advantageous to them and not necessarily so worried about being the alternate. They're just selling it as the alternate to a system that they're trying to say isn't working for anyone, right? I think that's where I've seen the biggest shift where they're saying that this alternative system is best for everyone. And I haven't seen any of their systems actually work, right? They come up with a 4-point plan for different Middle East conflicts, and none of those have any meat or substance to them and never produce anything that's actually brings more peace. And I think the same is happening with the rest of the rhetoric, that they don't really produce, in my opinion, anything that's actually benefiting the global south in terms of actual initiatives. And there are some projects that are happening that I'm sure are benefiting. It's not an all or nothing, but on the whole, I think the US has a much better story to tell there. And that's something that I think, yeah, as we push back against the rhetoric that China's putting out, that's something that we can do better here in Washington and abroad.
Yeah, I think you encapsulated that entirely well. I agree with it 100%. At the end of the day, China is Zhongguo. It is the
Yeah.
central country, and that is their focus. But with that in mind, it doesn't have that global support system through policy. I think last one or two questions. Were you surprised at all at the news today that Trump called the deal off?
Yeah, we'll see what actually happens, right? Like Trump
Yeah.
says things, markets move. Trump says other things. I think that's what's the most interesting part as being a bureaucrat in a Trump administration versus a different administration. I always found that I was on my toes. And I thought that was super fascinating, being able to support the president's agenda and in seeing how, there's a lot of approvals usually, and a whole apparatus usually working behind the president to put out information. And we can see with this president, it's much more top down. And so it's really fascinating to me to see how quickly policy shifts depending on and how much more nimble it is in some ways. I know a lot of Washington would probably disagree with me on that, but I actually find it fascinating and almost advantageous for the US in situations like this where China's usually like that. And so I think to some degree it can be good. Obviously it has its downsides and we could get into that, but I'm going to stay relatively positive about this. But yeah, I think in general with the Middle East, like I said, like it's the most predictable, unpredictable chaos you can have, right? So I think that unfortunately, the mistrust that a lot of people have for the Iranian regime, which it makes sense, that mistrust was always there. I think that was one of the biggest quotes coming out of Trump today, was that he essentially said, we can't trust them, right? They're untrustworthy. And I think that's the biggest part for negotiations, right? If you're negotiating with anyone, especially a regime that is your quote, is your enemy, is someone that's you're never going to see eye to eye with, if you need to have even the little bit of trust that you could get the minute amount in order to have a deal. And so I think that in this case, there's not any hope for trust to be regained. And I think that everyone knew it was on thin ice because just the actual parts of the deal were, what's the word I'm looking for? They were just not so advantageous to either side. And if so, if also most people would say that the deal was most advantageous to Iran. I don't even really know. I just don't think anyone was getting peace out of the deal. It was just suspending peace for or it was encapsulating peace for 60 days in some sort of deal. So I think that unfortunately it didn't even last 60 days potentially here. We'll have to see. But I think even more interesting, and if you'll have me on again, I think interesting follow up would be, where does Israel fall in this, right? Like there's going to be Israel essentially, if the deal falls apart, is going to also have to start making strikes and going to have to defend itself. And I know that I was reading a lot of articles in different Hebrew magazines and newspapers where there's real fear in Israel of, if the U.S. continues to strike, that the retaliatory strikes will only be on Israel, right? And so that I think we've seen so far that the strikes were actually on U.S. bases in the Gulf. So that's an interesting kind of shift to me. And so we'll see what kind of plays out that way, but how Israel gets involved, what that means for Israel-Lebanon peace, what that means for the region in general. It's going to be super fascinating in the next few weeks. I'm an idealist, so hoping for all that we get somewhere peaceful here. And I think if we can, as the U.S., we have we have the best military in the world. We really do. I think something that we haven't talked about in this war is really how the U.S. military really has degraded a good amount of Iranian capability, and they really aren't any formidable military at this point. Even the IRGC doesn't even seem that strong, right? If you're able to hit all those IRGC material and everything on within a night to help stop strikes in the Strait of Hormuz, I think that says a lot about our military. And so I think we'll be able to keep going and put Iran on its back foot and maybe they'll come back to the table. But I'm just more concerned that the U.S. will lose hope in the negotiations and not try to come back to the table, because as a diplomat at heart, I think that's the best place to be. But we'll see.
Yeah. The first time I was in Washington, D.C., I was working on anti-ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea beat. And I remember with Iran in particular, we were doing consulting I was at a boutique firm. We were doing consulting for AFA, DOD, that type of stuff. I just remember I felt like I was always hitting my head against the wall because we would be talking about the IAEA and establishing trust, checking uranium levels, XYZ. And it just felt like it was for naught. So I remember at the time that was one reason why I decided to expand and try to do more outside of policy and talk more with multinational corporations, companies, because I wanted to understand how power was working differently. Because I felt like just at the state level there, in terms of the bilateral relationship we had, there was really no clear discussion or movement. With this administration, what you're pointing to, again, I'm not going to moralize on the pros and cons of what we're doing, but it's fascinating the speed at which we can execute certain actions, policies under this administration. So that's been fascinating to see. Definitely, you always have an open invite back on. I was actually going to see because I want to hear more about your upcoming plans. But I think, yeah, there's just so much going on with the world. I really appreciate you coming on and breaking this down. I think before I let you go, I'm wondering, is there any advice that you would want to share with policymakers or anyone working in these engagements?
Yeah, I think the big thing I would want to share is that China is rivaling us, and we know that, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. We're smart, nimble society with great morals that we can share with the rest of the world, and I think the rest of the world will want to see those morals live and values live. And I think that we should work towards that story rather and work towards peace rather than trying to and stay eyes wide open, but seeing we're smart. We don't have to take a bad thing or something that's inherently negative, like a rivalry. We can use that to our advantage where necessary.
Thank you for coming on to the podcast, Lauren. It is a pleasure having you. You are so insightful. I'm really excited for your work to come out. And yes, definitely we will have to link up again and chat. This was super fun.
Thanks. Have a good one,
Thanks.
Chelsea. Thank you for
Okay.
having me, and I'll definitely be back.